Thanks everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate the opportunity to get in front of you and talk about this crazy topic, the state of sales tax and what's been happening since that South Dakota versus Wayfair ruling. So I just wanted to throw out a quick disclaimer that today's presentation is really meant to be an overview and a high-level overview of what's happening in the industry and a little bit about Avalara as an organization. It is not meant to be a substitute for professional or legal tax advice. So I just encourage you, if there are specific questions for your business when it comes to advice such as that, I'd encourage you to consult with your tax advisor for more detailed information there. But with that, like Brad said, my name is Elaine Coleman, and I work closely with the team at Turnkey to ensure that you guys have the right solutions for your organization. And we're one of many ISVs that Turnkey works with to provide a full end-to-end solution with your products that you're working with Turnkey today. Now what we're going to cover today is what is this South Dakota versus Wayfair ruling, how it could affect you, and what are some things that you can do moving forward if this is something that is affecting your business today. We'll talk a little bit about why automating your tax compliance solution is a good thing for you, and then we'll end it with just a little bit about us as an organization. So why don't we go ahead and jump into this? What's the big deal about the South Dakota versus Wayfair and this thing called economic nexus? But what I want to do first is kind of, go back in time. And what's the big deal with sales tax? And why is it something that we're always thinking about and having to be compliant with? And really, when you look back in history, and this is digging back into my brain as well, but sales tax has been around for almost since the beginning of time. I mean, it's helped build many civilizations such as the ancient pyramids and the Roman Empire. And if you think about some of the U.S. history, I know a fun thing that I remember learning back in elementary school was the Boston Tea Party. Well, what was that all about? Well, as we all know, it was all about sales tax. And so that's what we're talking about today is the sales tax landscape in the United States. And so let's just think about what was the buzz about with South Dakota versus Wayfair, and why is it important to you? Well, really, this ruling is super important here because it overturned that long-standing physical presence nexus rule. And what that was is that states needed to have a companies needed to have a physical presence in a state in order to have that obligation to collect and remit sales tax. Well, what happened with South Dakota versus Wayfair is the Supreme Court ruled in favor of South Dakota because at the time, a year and a half ago, even a little bit before that when it all started a couple of years ago, they were looking at how the landscape has changed in the way of sales, and remote selling, cross-state selling, and e-commerce was a huge factor in this, that people are selling into states and they don't necessarily have a physical presence, but they really could have a way to impose sales tax obligations to those out-of-state transactions. And with the ruling in favor of South Dakota, it gave South Dakota that ability to impose those obligations to companies. So then the question is, who's affected? Well, basically, all remote sellers, whether it's online or offline, so if you're taking phone calls, fax orders, as well as those online orders, if you're not registered within that state of South Dakota and you meet the threshold requirements of $100,000 or 200 transactions in a 12-month period, you have that obligation to collect and remit sales tax. And that new law is called economic nexus. So basically, what is that? It's an additional nexus law that requires your organization to collect that tax and remit it back to the state. So unlike physical presence, we covered this before, it's solely based on sales revenue or transaction volume, and in some cases both. So there's some statements within each state that it's an and or just one. So with most every state, they're going to have different laws and criteria. They'll have different dates when it's coming into full requirement to collect and remit that sales tax. And it's both brick and mortar as well as online businesses that are required for that. So to give you an idea on what some of those thresholds look like and how some of the states may vary, here are just some examples. So South Dakota was the very first state that was granted the ability to enforce economic nexus, but let me tell you, every state in the union was watching what was happening with this and deciding, what are we going to do if this ruling is in favor of South Dakota? And as you can see, some states were Johnny on the spot. You've got Hawaii, effective date July 1st of 2018, about 2.5 weeks after the ruling was in place. And what Hawaii decided is we're going to be very similar, or if not the same as South Dakota. And it's a sales or transaction volume, and the threshold is $100,000 in sales or 200 transactions. And then as you can see on the sides of Hawaii here, Colorado and Tennessee are a little bit different. They took some time to really kind of decide, what are we going to do? How do we want this to look? And those two states decided that the trigger would be sales only. And their transaction or their sales volume was different. So Colorado has a much lower threshold than Tennessee. So the point here is this something you want to manage manually? Most of you are probably shaking your head going, no, this isn't something that I want to do. And if you're curious about the other states, we have a link up here, and we can send that out when Brad sends the recording, as far as the specific guides, state by state, what the requirements are, what the thresholds are, and when the effective date is. Now I wanted to show you a visual on what's happened since the ruling in June of 2018. So we have a majority of the states that have said, me too. I'm going to enact this economic nexus. There's a lot of missed tax revenue that I think I'm owed, and we're going to jump on the board and say, here's our thresholds. And like I said before, most of the states simply copy and pasted what South Dakota did, but others didn't. And we're seeing even more unique things happening. So here in Alaska, I don't know how familiar you are with Alaska, but Alaska has traditionally not been a sales tax state. But what's happening now is you have cities within Alaska that are saying, I think we're missing out on some things, and I think we're going to start charging tax in our city. So it isn't always just a statewide tax. You need to drill down into a city tax or a jurisdictional tax that you need to keep track of as well. And that will be affecting you as the states are making changes and adding to their laws. So it's something to be aware of and keep an eye on. Now I'm an extremely visual person. You're going to see this throughout the presentation, but I wanted to show you how the South Dakota versus Wayfair ruling can affect a typical small and medium business. So before economic nexus was in play, you might have a typical small and medium organization that has headquarters in California, probably a warehouse in Texas, and they have a remote office out east. And so they managed roughly 3 states that they need to keep track of with sales tax collection and remittance. But once the economic nexus law came into effect, they went from managing 3 states to 30 states. They may have added an e-com site over so many years. They have always had interstate transactions, but they just didn't do enough that they met any type of nexus requirements for physical presence in the other states. So now they have a lot of things to track and information to keep compliant with, moving from 3 states to 30 states. So it's a big impact on businesses, and it can be a big impact if you weren't aware that this was happening. So a lot of companies I've talked with in the past year and a half have said, hey, I've never had to collect sales tax. I don't have to worry about that. I'm a wholesaler and it's no big deal for me. But it actually can be because this ruling created new Nexus obligations for other types of businesses. So in the case of a manufacturer, someone who almost 100% of sales are either OEMs or reseller to dealers, um, they had an increased burden to prove why they're not collecting tax. So before it was about 75 exemption certificates they had to manage, and now it's increased to almost 1,200. That's a huge jump in just proving why I'm not collecting sales tax. Same thing with the wholesaler. Um, they weren't collecting sales tax. They didn't have to. They still had to manage certificates, so that's always been a part of their business. But now their burden of proof has gone from 500 to over 5,000 on file. So it can be more than just, collecting the sales tax and making sure that you have the right rate tables, etc. It can be also proving why you're not. So that's a huge impact on a business. So there's something out in the land of sales tax called SST, and there's a nice little thing that you could potentially be able to automate compliance for free. So I want to talk about that today on the short amount of time I have in front of you, and this is really important. There's a group that was formed back in 1999. This has been around for a while, but it really wasn't applicable prior to the economic nexus. And the Streamline Sales Tax Initiative was created by a group of state and local governments really to figure out a way to simplify the sales and use tax collection and remittance for retailers that sold into multiple states. And they wanted to figure out a way to basically make it easier to do business with the states. So it's been around for a long time, but it wasn't really applicable. And so now with the economic nexus challenges, it really is something that more states or more companies, I apologize for saying that states, but more companies are realizing, I could probably benefit from this offering from these states. And so if you're doing business in these 24 states or some of those states, you could potentially qualify for free registrations, free calculations, free returns, and a few other things posted here. So Avalara is one of a very few handful of certified service providers that have met all of the requirements through the SST governing board, where they've put the stamp of approval on the product and the services offered and say, this is a company we back, this is a company that can perform the seller's sales and use tax functions on behalf of the companies that have applied within the SST states. So those states work directly with Avalara to pay for those services, and if you qualify, you can get that for free. So we want to help you be able to do that. And so I encourage you to talk with your rep from Turnkey. They can get you in touch with our sales executives here at Avalara and have a conversation with you to see if it is something that you qualify for. So then the other thing with economic nexus is, what should I do if I think that I have some obligations in some states that I didn't realize before? Once you go through the guide and you see what those thresholds are, the one thing that's very important is you may need multiple types of licenses in different places in order to transact in the states. So some states require a business license to conduct business in a specific jurisdiction. Other states simply require a state tax registration, or they may also call it a state tax license to collect and remit taxes in those jurisdictions. So there's a site with Avalara that we can help you do that. If you fully realize that I went from 3 states to 30 states and you kind of want that one-stop shop to register in the proper states, this is the link that you'll want to be aware of. It is a service that we actually team up with a third party that does this for a business, but it's just an added thing, makes it super easy to get those licenses in the areas where you need to have them. And finally, what should I do? There's been a lot of information thrown out at me about this whole South Dakota versus Wayfair. And again, you're thinking, I think I have some changes that I really need to implement, but I'm not 100% sure where and how it's going to impact my business. First and foremost, we want you to contact your state and local tax expert. Sit down with them, figure out all the questions you have about the Nexus requirements and the laws in those states. Figure out where you potentially do have Nexus or how you monitor for those, and get that set up. And then if it's something that you want to move forward with Avalara to get things automated, we can help you with that. If you don't have someone, we have a directory of experts we can connect you with, and we also have some services that we can help get you on track as well. And then finally, when it comes to um, the rulings and all of the information, and if you have more in-depth questions, we have a lot of information on our website, and there's a very specific area just for the South Dakota versus Wayfair ruling. The thing that I've been talking a lot today about is that economic nexus guide in the middle. It walks through each state and what their requirements are, what their thresholds are, and when everything was enacted. So lots of information. But why talk about this automating tax compliance? And I mean, ultimately, it's made to make your life easier, because when you look at all of the things that are changing every year within the state of sales tax, South Dakota versus Wayfair being a very major one, but every year there's approximately 1,000 changes across the United States within all of the 12,000 plus jurisdictions. And there's, thousands of changes made specific to the tax rates and laws. So trying to keep up with that can be absolutely circus-like, and you can feel like this elephant balancing on the ball with other things up in the air, trying to make sure you're not making any mistakes. And we want to help you with that and make it easier. The other thing that we look at is when you do things manually, it's very risky, and humans, we're not perfect. We're prone to errors, and we could miss some things. And this slide here was done through Aberdeen Research Group and Wakefield Research, and they took a look at people within finance and asked a lot of questions, and was just wondering, so how accurate do you think you are? Do you think you're 100% compliant? And when an auditor will come in, they won't find any mistakes. And the interesting thing here is through that research, they found that 3/4, I'm so sorry, it's one of those days, 3/4 of the people in finance say, most likely a mistake is going to be found. But I'm okay with that. I've budgeted for that, and I think we'll be fine. That can be a very risky thing with auditors, because you're not always sure what they might find. And if you're not on top of changes, it could be very, very expensive and time consuming for a company. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen to you. And a lot of times people are thinking, for tax compliance, as long as I have the rates correct and the tax calculations correct, I'll be fine. But the tax calculations are really that proverbial tip of the iceberg. And as you can see here, there's so many other things that you have to be compliant with in order to have auditors be happy. And all of those efforts spent keeping that compliant and making sure that things are right, it's not bringing revenue into your company, it's just keeping things compliant. And so we want to make sure you're focused on the things that can grow your business and take your business in the direction that you want it to go. And so just another reason why automating can help. And with Avalara, we can help with all of those issues that support those tax computations. So when you look at Nexus, as you're growing and as you're adding, whether it's economic nexus or other nexus obligations, you can add those jurisdictions with a simple single click. We make it easy and automated for you. In the lines of product taxability, we have built-in rules and we update those rules constantly. An example that I like to run into is, do you want to track products such as candy, for example? So I have a sweet tooth and I absolutely love candy bars. And when I go into the store and I buy a Butterfinger versus a Twix, because I just can't decide between my two favorite candy bars. And if you look at a receipt, and I encourage all of you guys to test this out in your state and see if it's the same, but I know in Minnesota, if I buy a Butterfinger and a Twix at the store, one will be taxed and the other won't be taxed. All of you out there listening, can you think of why that might be? And you can certainly enter it into the chat if you want, but I'll give you the answer so you're not hanging on the edge of your seat. But the Twix is tax exempt and the Butterfinger is taxed. And then the question is why? Why is that? Well, because of the flour content in a Twix, because there's a cookie running through that, it is considered a grocery item, where the Butterfinger is not. And so those of you who love Butterfingers like I do have to pay sales tax on that because it's considered a candy, where the Twix is a grocery item. So who wants to track all of those product taxability rules? I don't think I want to. I like to use the smart people behind the scenes here at Avalara who keep track of all of that and build that into the product. So that for me is an easy choice. Now the other thing with, under the iceberg and all of the compliance factors is jurisdictional assignments. So I've heard from quite a few folks that I've worked with in the past few years that I've been doing this is I found some free rate tables that I download and I have my IT group update those probably once a year and that should be good enough, right? Well, the answer is wrong. Zip code rates are not offering businesses 100% compliance. In order to have 100% compliance when it comes to jurisdictional assignments, you need to do full address validation using that address and not just the zip code. And the way Avalara does it is we have the longitude and latitude location, ensuring that we're pulling in the right jurisdiction and the guaranteed proper tax rates for those jurisdictions. Finally, that certificate management that we talked about, if you are one of those types of companies that you could potentially have a burden, 10x the amount that you've normally had to manage, with automatic certificate management, expiration notifications, being able to have everything stored online, easily accessible for auditors, that is huge for companies who need to prove that tax exempt status. And then finally, state and local prep and filing is huge. That example going from 3 states to 30 states, are you capable or do you want to manage all of the deadlines and the filing deadlines and requirements that every state requires? Not all states are the same. And so managing those filing deadlines and what they require you to submit can be an absolute nightmare. So we offer services that can help you automate that as well. And then finally, the ever-presence audit. When you're notified of an audit, are you ready? Do you have all of the information readily at hand where you can just point an auditor to a report or give them a login to a site where they can get all of their information? Avalara offers easy access to those documents and the data that you need when an auditor comes calling. So finally, who is Avalara and what does the solution look like? Well, we're a company that has been around for 15 years. We started out our very first solution integrated into Dynamics. We have always been cloud-based, so everything that we have is as real-time as possible. And so we've built up our business over the years, 25,000 plus active customers with over 700 pre-built integrations. So what that's telling you is that just about anything you're using today to invoice a client or to send a bill or to commit a transaction, Avalara most likely has an integration into that piece. And if we don't have something that's pre-built, we offer API so that either your partner or someone in-house can actually write a custom integration into that solution that you're working with today. So with that growing solution, there's one thing that we've focused on throughout these 15 years, and it's one thing that we know, and it's tax and tax compliance. So I wanted to show you quick a new feature within AvaTax that really helps with all of this economic nexus, and it's this notification. So within our admin console, this is brand new. We had it ready to go. So if South Dakota versus Wayfair ruled in favor of South Dakota, it was ready for you. So this is a great thing. It shows you where you have Nexus currently based on all of your transactions and where you're coming up, where that threshold is fast approaching. It's going to notify you and tell you what you should do or what you should think about doing. So real quick, I know we're coming up to time, so how do we do it? We basically have 3 pillars of products within our Avalara sales tax suite. The first base product, if you will, is AvaTax, and that's your tax calculation engine. So this is where AvaTax talks to your system, whether it's your ERP or your point of sale system or your billing system, and it validates all of the information. It does the things that I talked about in that underneath the iceberg. It makes the call, it validates the address, it ensures that a product is taxable or not. And then if you have Cert Capture, it will also go over to Cert Capture and decide, is this customer supposed to be taxed or not? Cert Capture also manages all of the certificates. It will notify you and your customers if one is expiring, and you can update those certificates with one click and one link. And then finally, making sure that the government has what they want, returns filing, and doing everything on time with the requirements of the states. We're able to handle that and offer that service as well. So with over 25,000 customers using Avalara with a 98% retention rating, we make sure that we're getting tax compliance right, and we're making sure that things are accurate, efficient, and integrated into the systems that you're using today. So with that, I know we've only got about a minute for questions, but I'm happy to answer any questions that have come up, Brad. I'm not sure if you're seeing anything, but I'll certainly open it up.
Hey, Elaine, it doesn't look like we have any questions at this time.
Okay.
Was there anything else that you did want to add before we wrap up?
Not that I can think of. I know that questions do come up once, once you've left and you want to think of things. Either send them directly to me. My email address is here on the screen, or certainly reach out to Brad or your contact at Turnkey, and they can get a hold of me and our team at Avalara, and we can help you move forward.